In 1991, a journalist stood in front of a camera and interviewed the chief of police about a series of murders that were terrifying Vienna. He asked the right questions. He seemed genuinely outraged. He even suggested that the killer must be someone deeply disturbed, someone hiding in plain sight. He was right, because that journalist was the killer. His name was Jack Unterweger, and by the time the police realized what he had done, he had already committed murders on 2 continents while working as a respected television presenter, literary celebrity, and symbol of rehabilitation. This is one of the most disturbing cases in European criminal history, not because of the violence alone, but because of how completely one man fooled an entire country, and how much they wanted to believe him. His mother, Theresia Unterweger, came from southern Austria. He later described her as a sex worker, though her life was simply unstable. What is certain is that his childhood was marked by neglect. His father disappeared before he was born. His mother was repeatedly imprisoned, and by the age of 2, Jack was left with his grandfather, whom he later described as abusive. By 6, social services removed him. He kept hoping his mother would come back. She never did. Investigators later believed this abandonment shaped his resentment toward women, but even his own version of childhood cannot be fully trusted. His school teacher remembered him very differently, as a charming, good-looking boy who was neatly dressed and well-liked, especially by girls in his class. At the same time, he was mocked by some of the other children for being born out of wedlock, which, in that environment, still carried a social stigma. At 15, he dropped out of school and committed his first theft, which led to his placement in a juvenile detention center near Vienna, where he spent about a year. After his release, he became increasingly involved in the underworld, associating with pimps and male sex workers. And during this period, his life took a sharper turn into criminality, accompanied by heavy drug use that appeared to intensify his aggression. By his early 20s, he was already engaged in car theft and various petty crimes, but at some point, he crossed a far more serious line. At some point, his crimes escalated. He abducted and assaulted a young woman who survived and reported the attack, but Unterweger managed to flee, and the case remained unsolved. Another, far more serious crime followed in 1973, when he committed his first known murder. The victim was a young Croatian woman named Marisa Horvath. He met her near a railway station outside Salzburg and drove her to a secluded lakeside, where he tied her hands with his tie, struck her, and forced her into the water, where she drowned. The lead homicide detective later described the case as an example of extreme brutality. And yet, despite the severity of the crime, Unterweger was never identified as a suspect at the time. His involvement would only become clear years later, and even then, he would not be held accountable for that murder. A year later, his violence escalated again. His next victim was 18-year-old Margaret Schaefer. At that time, Unterweger was in a relationship with a woman named Barbara Schultz, who had run away from home to Zurich, where they met. When they ran out of money, Jack suggested breaking into her parents' house, and she agreed. They traveled to the town of Hessen in Germany, but ultimately failed to get inside and abandoned the plan. As they were leaving, they encountered Barbara's school friend, Margaret, and invited her to join them for a drink and a drive. She agreed and got into the car, unaware of what was about to happen. Soon after, his behavior turned aggressive. They drove into a forest, where Barbara stayed in the car while he led Margaret deeper into the woods. There he beat her with a steel rod and strangled her with her own bra. A week later, her body was found by a hunter, positioned against a tree, as if deliberately arranged. Her clothes had been torn off, her hands bound, and the method closely mirrored an earlier killing. One detail stood out: the knot used in the ligature. It would later link multiple crimes back to Unterweger. Even in court, he could not explain the level of violence he displayed. The police quickly established a connection between Margaret and her friend Barbara Schultz, and Barbara's testimony became central to the case. Unterweger was arrested. Barbara's reaction, however, was deeply conflicted. She had witnessed a brutal, sadistic murder and was horrified by what Jack had done to her friend. Yet at the same time, she was emotionally attached to him. Unterweger often came across as two completely different people. In one moment, he could be gentle, attentive, even comforting, creating a sense of safety around him, and in the next, that facade would collapse, revealing a sudden and violent aggression. Throughout the investigation and the trial, he denied his guilt, but Barbara's testimony, combined with circumstantial evidence, was enough to secure a conviction. Investigators were able to establish that Jack and Barbara were the last people to see Margaret alive, and under that pressure, Unterweger began searching for explanations rather than denying the act itself. He claimed that on the day of the murder, he had been heavily intoxicated and under the influence of drugs, insisting that he did not understand what he was doing, that some uncontrollable aggression had taken over. The investigators were not satisfied with this explanation. There was no sign of robbery, which ruled out a financial motive, and there had been no prior relationship between him and Margaret, eliminating personal conflict as a cause. During the trial, Unterweger offered another explanation, that he had projected his anger toward his mother onto Margaret. The psychiatrist admitted this was possible, but the broader evaluation did not support it. Experts ultimately concluded the murder was not driven by trauma or loss of control, but by the fact that he derived gratification from it. In 1976, Jack Unterweger was sentenced to life imprisonment. While in prison, he completed his education, read extensively, and enrolled in writing courses, and in 1982, he published his first book, an autobiographical novel titled Purgatory, which became a bestseller. Through writing, he began to construct a narrative of self-reflection, presenting himself as someone trying to understand the origins of his behavior and the path that had led him to prison. However, the omissions in his story were just as telling as what he included. He did not express genuine remorse, and more importantly, he did not even mention the murder of Margaret Schaefer, instead portraying his imprisonment as the result of a far less serious crime. This raises an obvious question. Was this truly an attempt at self-examination, or simply another carefully crafted version of himself? Over the following years, his literary career grew. He published books, wrote plays and scripts, and was widely recognized as a writer. He also had a daughter he had never been present for, a detail he later used to shape his public image, despite showing little real interest in her life. By the mid-1980s, his name appeared frequently in the Austrian press, as his story became part of a larger conversation about rehabilitation. At the time, Austria was actively promoting reintegration over punishment, and Unterweger's transformation fit perfectly into that narrative. He was embraced by intellectual circles as a symbol of successful rehabilitation. He was often compared to the French writer Jean Genet, although there was a critical difference that was sometimes overlooked. Genet had been a thief, not a murderer. It seemed at times that the crime itself became secondary to the story people wanted to believe. Under Austrian law, a life sentence allows for the possibility of parole after 15 years, and before any decision was made, Unterweger underwent psychiatric evaluation. The conclusion was that he was mentally stable and no longer posed a threat. In May 1990, the court granted his release. Before moving forward, it is worth pausing on a single uncomfortable thought. A man was released back into society without anyone truly understanding who he was. And if the experts did not fully understand him, then the public understood even less. As part of his parole conditions, Unterweger was supposed to remain under supervision. A social worker was assigned to meet with Unterweger from time to time and monitor his reintegration into society. But in practice, this oversight appears to have been little more than a formality. The police were no longer responsible for him, as their authority extends only to suspects, not to individuals who have already been released. Technically, he did have a supervisory officer, but there is a strong sense that this supervision existed mostly on paper, raising an uncomfortable question. Did anyone seriously consider that Unterweger might return to killing? In many ways, he did not resemble the typical former inmate under observation. Instead of returning to a marginal environment, he stepped directly into public life. He wrote for glossy magazines, produced reports for television and radio, and focused on topics such as crime, human trafficking, social inequality, and the lives of sex workers. His name appeared regularly in newspapers, and one German publication even dedicated an entire feature to his book. He was invited onto television talk shows, attended social events, and was recognized in public, often approached by admirers. Alongside his journalism, he continued writing literature and traveled across Austria, presenting his plays and reading excerpts from his work to audiences. He dreamed of having one of his plays staged at the Berg Theatre. That never happened, but smaller theatres across the country were willing to collaborate with him. And it was during this period, after his release, that women in different parts of Austria began to disappear. Unterweger cultivated a striking public image, wearing elegant white suits with silk ties and driving a Ford Mustang, a car that at the time carried certain associations with the underworld, despite the fact that he did not even have a driver's license. The moment he was released, he distanced himself from the intellectual circles that had once supported him and shifted almost entirely into the company of women. In fact, he showed little interest in maintaining relationships with men at all. His lifestyle clearly exceeded what his reporting income could support. Much of it was financed by one of his lovers, a wealthy married woman who provided him with an apartment in Vienna's prestigious 8th district and covered his daily expenses. According to his own notes, over the 18 months he spent free, he had relationships with around 150 women. His life revolved around seduction, and the range of women he attracted was striking, from very young women to older, affluent partners, from students to successful professionals. Many of them were emotionally sensitive, intellectually inclined, and drawn to the version of himself that he chose to present: attentive, supportive, and unusually understanding. For some, he appeared to be the most empathetic partner they had ever known. 4 months after his release, in September 1990, the body of a Czech sex worker, Blanka Bokova, was found near a river in Prague, strangled with her own stockings. Unterweger had been in the city at the time, working on an article about the red light district. He had learned to choose victims who could not easily be traced back to him. Street-based sex workers, surrounded by countless clients, made identification far more difficult. By late October, another murder followed near Graz. 39-year-old Brunhilde Masser was found strangled with tights. In December, near Lustenau, Heide Hammerer was beaten and killed in the same way. In March 1991, Elfriede Schrempf became the next victim. Most of the bodies were discovered weeks, sometimes months later. Many of these women had no one actively looking for them. In the spring of 1991, the killings continued in Vienna. Sabine Moitz, 25, was found in the Vienna woods after her body had lain there for over a month. Strangled with tights, there were no usable traces left behind. Days later, Karin Eroglu was found, strangled with her own clothing. In August, 2 more victims, Sylvia Zegler and Regina Prem, were discovered. Regina had gone to meet a client and never returned. The pattern was clear. The method never changed. There was no clear motive, no robbery, no personal connection, no revenge. What became increasingly evident was that the act itself seemed to be the motive, and that realization explained the level of control and planning behind each crime. It took the Vienna police nearly 6 months to connect the cases and acknowledge that they were dealing with a serial offender. The investigation was led by Max Edelbacher, who later admitted he had no experience with serial killers. Detectives questioned sex workers and pimps, searching for any unusually aggressive clients. One theory suggested the killer could be a traveling salesman, explaining the spread of the crimes, but at that stage, they had no suspect and no clear direction. As the murders began to attract media attention, newspapers published increasingly sensational coverage, and it was at this moment that Unterweger made a move that raised no suspicion at all. He predložil his editor to cover the investigation. He appeared on Austrian national radio and said, "I grew up around sex workers. My mother was one, my aunt was one. I understand this world, and I might be able to help find the killer." In June 1991, he found himself sitting face-to-face with Max Edelbacher. At the time, arranging such an interview required special permission from police headquarters, yet Unterweger managed it with ease. Edelbacher later recalled that he seemed intelligent, well-prepared, asking the right questions, while the investigation itself remained stalled. Unterweger asked in detail how the killer operated, what patterns had been identified, what the police knew so far. It almost felt like a game. A few days after the interview aired, he requested another meeting and casually mentioned that he would soon be traveling to California for an assignment, asking whether Edelbacher had any contacts within the Los Angeles Police Department. Unterweger had long been fascinated by the United States. It was where his father had lived and where he hoped, one day, to build a different life. He also wanted to find a director who might adapt his autobiography into a film. Neither of those ambitions materialized. What he did gain, however, was access. He befriended officers in Los Angeles, joined them on patrols, and immersed himself in their discussions about crime in the city. That same summer, 3 sex workers were murdered in Los Angeles. 20-year-old Shannon Exley was strangled with her bra and left in an empty lot. 33-year-old Irene Rodriguez was found by a homeless man in a parking area, lying beneath a truck trailer, partially undressed. The third victim, Sherry Long, was discovered by a group of young people who had gone to watch a solar eclipse from the hills of Malibu. She, too, had been strangled with her bra. By then, Unterweger seemed convinced that he was untouchable, that he was smarter than the police and could continue to manipulate them without consequence. He also understood that Vienna's red light district was now under close surveillance, which meant that if he wanted to continue, he needed to operate elsewhere. Somewhere no one knew his past. For Edelbacher, Unterweger might have remained just another public figure from television, if not for a call from a retired Salzburg police officer named August Schöner. Back in 1973, Schöner had investigated the murder of Marisa Horvath, a young woman who had been assaulted and strangled with her own bra. The case had never been solved. Now, he suggested taking a closer look at Unterweger and even expressed confidence that he was the killer. At first, the Vienna police did not take this seriously. It was difficult to reconcile the image of a well-dressed, charismatic public figure, surrounded by admirers, with that of a man murdering street-based sex workers. Around the same time, 2 American profilers passed through Vienna on their way to Moscow and offered their perspective, suggesting that Austria might be dealing with a serial killer. Their warning was largely dismissed. Edelbacher, however, decided to check Unterweger's alibi. That decision changed everything. The locations of the murders aligned almost perfectly with Unterweger's travel schedule. Each time he arrived in a town for a book reading or public appearance, a woman would later be found dead. A pattern also emerged in his behavior. After a failed appearance in a small town near Graz, where no one showed up to his event, he left, drove for miles, picked up a woman on the road, and took her into the forest. Around the same time, another critical call came in, this time from the United States. American investigators had concluded that the murders in Los Angeles had been committed using the same distinctive ligature technique, with a knot identical to the one found in the Vienna cases. More importantly, the dates of those killings matched Unterweger's stay in California. In February 1992, Max Edelbacher made the decision to arrest him. Shortly afterward, Unterweger received a warning from an acquaintance connected to the red light district. He was about to be taken into custody, and he ran. Together with his 18-year-old girlfriend, Bianca Mrek, Unterweger fled first to Switzerland, then to Paris, and eventually to Miami. But even after escaping Austrian justice and reaching the United States, he had no intention of disappearing. Instead of lying low, he began reaching out, first to the police in Graz, insisting on his innocence, and when they privileged cooperation, he refused, saying he could not bear the thought of returning to a cell and that the accusations had already destroyed his reputation. He then contacted Austrian journalists, presenting himself as a victim of injustice. The press quickly reignited the story. Headlines once again filled with his name, the murders, and the arrest warrant issued against him. Soon after, he gave a television interview, claiming he would only return if he were guaranteed immunity. For someone who had been meticulous in planning his crimes, Unterweger showed a surprising lack of caution while on the run. That carelessness was driven in part by vanity and increasingly by financial pressure. At one point, he called a woman he knew in Vienna, Elizabeth, and admitted that he had been sleeping on the beach for several days. Once again, his fate was shaped by a woman. Elizabeth passed this information to a friend who worked at a magazine, who then informed her editor, and the editor contacted the police. A plan was quickly set in motion. Unterweger was offered $10,000 for an exclusive interview. He agreed. The next day, he and Bianca went to an American Express office in Miami to collect the money. Across the street, in a cafe, 2 U.S. Marshals were watching the entrance. Unterweger noticed them and tried to run. He was arrested shortly after. Officially, the arrest was made on a technical violation. He had entered the United States on a tourist visa without disclosing his criminal record. American authorities suspected him in 3 murders, and if they had been able to bring formal charges, he could have faced trial in the United States, where the death penalty was still a possibility. However, the evidence was not strong enough, and he was extradited to Austria. During a search of his belongings, investigators found photographs he had taken in Los Angeles. Those images would later become part of the evidence against him. Unterweger chose to face a jury trial in Austria. The public reaction was deeply divided. Many members of the intellectual elite, who had once advocated for his release, refused to believe the accusations. Some argued that if the charges were true, the case would be so extraordinary that it was almost impossible to accept, suggesting instead that the police had simply chosen a convenient suspect because of his past. In reality, the case against him was built largely on circumstantial evidence. He had no alibi. In 7 of the 11 murders, he was in the area at the time of the killings. A witness had seen his Ford Mustang near one of the crime scenes. The method was consistent, a distinctive ligature with a specific type of knot. Fibers found on one victim matched the material of his clothing, and in Prague, investigators discovered his abandoned BMW containing hair belonging to Blanka Bokova. Individually, none of these elements were conclusive. Together, they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Still, doubts remained. Early DNA analysis was limited, and some of the physical evidence raised questions about how well it could have been preserved. Certain items, such as fibers, were not unique and could be found widely. For some, that uncertainty was enough to reject the case entirely. One of those people was Astrid Wagner. She had first learned about Unterweger in the mid-1980s while studying law, developing an interest in criminology, and reading everything he had written. When the allegations surfaced, she was shocked. To her, he had already reintegrated into society, and the accusations felt like a collapse of that narrative. By the time he was back in prison, he had reportedly made several suicide attempts, which were widely covered in the Austrian press. After reading one of those reports, Wagner, now a practicing lawyer, wrote to him. They began corresponding. Soon after, she visited him in prison. Her first impression was not what she expected. On photographs, he appeared confident, composed, almost triumphant in his white suits. In reality, he looked fragile, worn down, dressed in a torn shirt, giving the impression of someone broken, vulnerable, even wounded. And yet, even in that state, he began to flirt, noticing the gold bracelet on her wrist with a small Taurus charm. He smiled and said, "Women born under Taurus, they're always so stubborn." That is how their prison relationship began. Astrid visited him twice a week, and over time, those visits added up to nearly 200 meetings. She brought him clothes, washed his veschi, supported him in every possible way, and, in the process, distanced herself from her own life. She broke up with her partner and fell out with family and friends. At first, she tried to keep her feelings under control, aware of where this could lead, imagining a future with him, while he, as she later discovered, was already telling his psychiatrist that he wanted to have children with her. And yet, somewhere beneath it all, she sensed that even if he were released, their relationship would not survive outside those walls. He was, in her words, a wounded soul, but so was she, in her own way, strong-willed and deeply involved. Her life began to revolve entirely around him. She believed everything he said, and Unterweger had little difficulty convincing her that the accusations against him were false. They were separated by a barrier, a thin mesh between them, but their connection extended beyond the visiting room. Years later, she would describe how, every Sunday, she would go to the roof of a nearby building, from where she could see his cell, and they would stand there waving to each other from a distance. And then, shortly before the verdict, something shifted. As she was about to leave, she turned back, approached him, and, in full view of the guards, they kissed. It was the first time, and the last. To Astrid, he was not a violent offender. During their meetings, he appeared attentive, thoughtful, even caring. Max Edelbacher remembered something similar, that conversations with Unterweger could flow easily for hours, but the moment the discussion turned to the murders, he would shut down completely, refusing to engage, even when asked about the crime for which he had already served time. A new psychiatric evaluation diagnosed him with multiple personality disorders, dissocial, sadistic, and narcissistic traits. Years earlier, before his release, no such conclusions had been reached. One psychiatrist later described him as a malignant narcissist, someone entirely absorbed in his own sense of importance, driven by vanity and an inflated self-image, but also incapable of tolerating frustration or the idea that others might be superior. His ego could not withstand loss of control. That testimony had a strong impact on the jury, perhaps even more than the physical evidence itself, and helped shape the perception of Unterweger as a dangerous serial offender. And yet, even the most precise diagnosis could not answer the central question. Why did he do it? No clear motive ever emerged. What can be said is that he seemed to derive a sense of power from the fact that he could act without consequences, that he could move through society, unseen, unpunished. The trial began in April 1994. The case file exceeded 20,000 pages. Unterweger was charged with 11 murders, 3 of them committed in the United States. Throughout the proceedings, he remained calm, articulate, and self-assured, attempting to build an emotional connection with the jury and convince them of his innocence. He denied everything until the very end. In his final statement, he admitted that in his youth he'd been selfish and cruel, that he had used women, but insisted that he valued the life he had built after prison, the writing, the recognition, the stability, and that he would never have risked returning to a cell. He maintained that there was no proof he had killed anyone. On June 28, 1994, the court found him guilty of 9 murders. 2 charges could not be proven due to insufficient evidence. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. 2 jurors believed in his innocence, but under Austrian law, a simple majority was enough for conviction. Had the trial taken place in the United States, where a unanimous verdict is required, the outcome might have been different. When the sentence was announced, Unterweger cried, not for the victims, but for himself. 6 hours later, in the early hours of the morning, he was found dead in his cell. He had taken his own life using a ligature fashioned from wire and cord, tied in the same distinctive knot that had been used in his crimes. That detail, too, became part of the case. There are 2 prevailing interpretations of his death. One suggests that he realized he would never leave prison again and chose not to spend the rest of his life behind bars. The other is more unsettling, that he may not have intended to die, knowing he was under supervision, possibly expecting to be rescued in time. Both remain plausible. The verdict was set to formally take effect 48 hours later. It never did. In death, Unterweger achieved something he had fought for all along. He died without a final, legally binding conviction. And that leaves one final question. What responsibility lies with those who once advocated for his release? This was the story of Jack Unterweger. If you've made it this far, you already know. Some stories don't end with answers, only with better questions.